What's up, guys, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about maining a Melee, DPS, and BFA. So you might be asking yourself, what makes a Melee DPS so special, right? What is the thing that sets it apart from all the other roles we've talked about so far in this series? And to be honest, it's really hard for me to tell you the intricacies or the differences compared to like a range DPS or compared to like a healer or a tank, because a lot of these things when it comes down to DPS are so minute. There's such a focus and a minute focus on that specific role that it's hard to just say this is exactly what makes or breaks this type of role. Obviously, when it comes down to any DPS-oriented role, your main goal is effectively doing DPS. Your main goal is to damage the target so that, the rest of the raid team can deal with mechanics less over time. Typically, what a DPS job really is to reduce the amount of time that we're on the boss so that we kill things quicker, so that certain effects don't happen, so we can phase the boss into certain phases that may be easier, so that we can get to certain parts of the fight that might be harder. Effectively, that's what a DPS's job is. But what does a melee DPS do specifically that makes it better than, let's say, a range DPS? A range DPS in general typically focuses mostly on dealing with range mechanics, which are the ones that melee typically don't have to do, like soaking certain puddles, dealing with certain abilities that only target range, because there's typically not many abilities that only target melee. Usually it's only abilities that target range. But when it comes to melee are typically dealing with hardcore interrupting all the time, basically trying to make sure that you're always communicating with your melee team, making sure they know whenever you're going to interrupt the target, making sure that you're calling these out, or making sure you're organizing these interrupts in a certain way, making sure that you're getting some nice stuns on targets, because you're the first person typically there compared to your range team. Your range team probably don't have an effective stun for the melee group or whatever kind of ads that are out, so typically that's left up to the melee. The melee in general do a lot in support of the team, and what they do is they typically are going around interrupting targets, killing targets really quickly, bursting down a lot of AoE packs. When you see a melee DPS, his job is typically to provide a lot of damage in a very quick amount of time. Overall, I think pretty much every melee has a DPS increase overall compared to the range. And the reason why Blizzard does this, increasing the DPS of all the melee overall, is so that whenever you're off the boss, whenever you're not targeting the boss, that's usually whenever your DPS is suffering the most. But since you have this DPS increase that's baseline throughout all melee, you are able to perform better, able to provide more to the team whenever you pop on, and it makes you way more effective on things like bursting or things like AoEing targets down and getting a lot of mobs dealt with and done with quickly. Now, before we go on anymore and we talk about melee specifically and what they do that's really well, we want to talk about what DPS do that's really important in a fight. And really what that is always make sure that the first thing you do, no matter what role you do, whenever you're playing in a raid environment or you're playing in a dungeon environment, is that you're dealing with the mechanics first. The mechanics are always the most important part of a raid fight or a dungeon encounter. It's so much more important for you to deal with the mechanics than it is for you to deal with, doing DPS or trying to get your DPS perfect on the first run through. Typically, when you're in a raid team, unless you're like really hardcore, you're going to wipe a couple times on that boss. You don't want to go in and waste your wipe attempts. You don't want to go into the boss and go hardcore DPS and not really understand what the rest of the fight's about. Your entire job when you first get on an encounter should be to hit that enrage timer. Your job should be to make sure that everyone else in the raid team is focused on their job, and you are there to assist them in doing their job and assist them in getting to that enrage timer. It doesn't matter what your DPS is. If you're at the bottom of the barrel, it's okay. It's not a big deal. The most important part about playing that role of DPS is ensuring that the mechanics of the fight are dealt with properly and that the DPS is allocated to the correct areas. Allocating your DPS typically means that when you see an ad or you see a really strong group of mobs coming out, you are there to adjust and attack the right ones, interrupt the right targets, DPS the right targets. And it doesn't really matter what your DPS is, but if your effective DPS is on the right target, then so much more effective than you being tunneling on the boss and doing a bunch of damage to the boss when you could be doing a lot of damage to the ads. So overall, you're more useful to the team if you perform your role in dealing the damage to accurate targets. A lot of DPS don't understand this, and I struggle with it in my own Mythic team, is that whenever we go into a new encounter, a lot of them like die and make mistakes, and that's reasonable. But a lot of people could save a lot of those attempts, a lot of those wipes, cut down a lot of those Argus wipes that we have right now. We're trying to progress through Argus before the next pre-patch. You could save a lot of those wipes if you would just back off a little bit. If you just back off and try to do the mechanics correctly, your DPS will come, and the entire group's DPS will cumulatively help kill the boss, and your DPS doesn't really matter as much then. And a lot of teams and a lot of groups and a lot of DPS struggle with this, and that's something that hopefully you'll have a better time dealing with in the future. One of the biggest important things when you're talking about maining a melee DPS, or any DPS in general really, is making sure that you're very accustomed to all the different talents that you have and all the different things at your disposal. If you're just a class that takes one talent row, or just plays with one little bit of thing, and you just know a rotation, you stick with that rotation, and you never switch off for anything else, you never try your AoE talents, you never try any other helpful abilities that might be in your arsenal, then you're going to hurt your team, and you're gonna overall make the experience worse for everyone else, because you gotta think of it on a larger scale. If you could be making this fight easier, you probably should be attempting to do that. Some effective tips for melee DPS, something that you really need to know as a melee that's gonna set you apart from range, because obviously range you have to deal with the same things melee do. You want to make sure that you're always finding a place on a target or a boss and staying there. A lot of DPS, a lot of melee DPS, for some reason have this issue where they like to hit their strafe keys back and forth a lot. And a lot of that's probably from, I don't know, dodging mechanics, or maybe you're used to dodging mechanics, maybe you're used to PvPing, because when you PvP, try to get behind the target. So a lot of people are like really spazzy when the melee DPS hop into the fray. A lot of the melee DPS underperform because they're like moving from mechanics they're not supposed to move to, they're moving into mechanics they're not supposed to move into, they're placing mechanics on areas where the boss is targeting. Maybe the boss is doing a cone effect on Argus, and it's doing lopsided and going all over the place because you aren't in the right position. Well, a really important thing for melee is to just focus on your area, pick a spot, and stay there. It's really important for you to stay there and just focus on what your job is. When it comes to a melee like a rogue, for instance, rogues and most melee who have really high movement, I pride myself on my rogue for doing really crazy tactics, really crazy things that range can't do, maybe because they have to cast an ability, or maybe because they don't have the movement that necessarily the melee have, because melee do get a huge movement kit compared to, I think, some of the range. And the reason why I think that the melee get a huge movement kit is because we are melee, we have to move a lot, we have to, truck across the room, where most range typically are either like mostly where they need to be, don't really have to move a whole lot, maybe they have to move a few inches, while the melee really have to truck across an entire room half the time when they need to follow the boss. So we have a really big kit typically for movement, and I feel that when it comes to playing a rogue specifically, and it's sort of a bloated example because rogues are sort of like the builders, the kit makers for this particular thing, but rogues tend to have this really zippy run around, help people out, do your thing. On Argus specifically tonight when I was raiding, my favorite thing about the fight isn't the DPS. I love doing damage, I love being top, I love pushing numbers, even though typically nowadays I'm not top anymore. But I do love pushing numbers, it's really fun, but I enjoy way more knowing that I'm saving the raid team. I enjoy way more knowing that no one else can do what I do because I can shadow step around the room and help people out. I know that there's a lot of other melee who can do things like that, heroic leaps, going across the room to an area, helping other people out with your melee abilities like that. Charging around the room, charging at mobs, that's really important. Using your horse as a paladin to get across the room to help other people out. These things are what make these classes special, and it's sort of like the niches we talked about in the other videos. These niches are what really sets melee apart from other classes, is really what kind of niche do you want to pick into. For rogue, shadow step's really fun. Having a sprint every minute is extremely useful and nice to have in a raid team. You having your feint is very nice too. These are certain types of mechanics that only these melee have. There aren't really any range who have the capabilities of a rogue. You know, there's the only thing I could even like remotely even come close to what the capabilities of rogue have is maybe a hunter. Hunters are sort of like the other class that are sort of like the mechanic bitch of the raid team. They go around and do whatever they can to help out the raid team, or at least they typically have been in the past. I'm not sure how much they are now, but typically in the past that's what they've done. And nowadays it's really just the melee have a responsibility, and the melee's responsibility is to do everything correctly while also performing well for their team and making themselves more accessible. I feel like it's something that as a melee myself, the rest of the melee team struggles with in my team, and maybe other teams too, is that making themselves accessible and making sure that they don't just put it all on the range and make the range do the shitty jobs and, you know, say, hey, we know the range should be taking care of people in range. You have a movement ability, you have a way of cutting that gap, making that distance, that problem with other people on your team, making, you know, the soaks and everything else when it comes to raiding, making that less of an issue. You can do it. You have the ability to do it. You just have to make sure you put yourself in the situation to do it. I know we talked a lot, and I know I've been rambling a whole bunch too, but, you know, it's really important that we talk about melee DPS and, you know, their roles, because identifying what this class or what this role does really helps us understand how each of the roles work in tandem with one another. Because as you can see in the video that I'm listing right now, you know, my main focus on that video right now that you're watching is I want to hit interrupts and I want to hit stuns, and that's pretty much what I'm focusing on most of the time as a melee. Is I want to make sure that I'm the one getting the interrupts so that the raid doesn't die, the raid doesn't have to deal with issues. I have certain abilities that I have that range don't really have. And it's my job to do that. It's my job to deal with that so that, you know, people can perform to their highest possibility. And a lot of melee struggle with this. And I think that, you know, it's something that hopefully in the future people will start to understand more, or people in the future, hopefully raiders and people who play in raid teams and, you know, play in their Mythic Plus teams really stop struggling with as much and start understanding how the game is supposed to be played. And they start working around the group and how the group feels, and not really just about who's doing best DPS. Because I feel like a lot of the times when we talk about DPS, you know, it's really more about how good the damage you're doing. And I feel like the damage aspect of doing DPS is important, but I also feel like a lot of the times when we try to look at DPS, we overcompensate and we like to forget about everything else and just look at the damage numbers. And a lot of teams struggle with tearing down those numbers and looking what really is going on and what the real importance is in the fight, which is, you know, damage allocation, which is, you know, escorting people, which is, you know, standing in AoE when you need to stand in AoE, when you need to help people out in your team. These are the most important aspects of playing a DPS and playing a melee DPS. There are some little differences for range, and we'll talk about that in the next video, but really when it comes down to it, the melee's cornerstone job is to be consistently good at pretty much everything. I feel like melee in general are the jack of all trades DPS, which they're basically meant to do pretty much everything that there is in the fight. I feel like both range and melee are expected to do that, but I feel like melee, more than ranged, have a responsibility to their team to perform and to assist the other raiders. Alright guys, I hope you liked the video, and, you know, today was a little weird, but, you know, I really hope that you guys enjoyed what I talked about. I hope you guys, you know, talk in the comments down below. I really enjoyed seeing those comments that you make, and really makes my day brighter and more happy. I really enjoy talking to you all, so please talk to me down in the comments below. If you have any questions or concerns or things you want to talk about that I didn't include here, because I'm sure there's something I didn't talk about. What is important to you for a melee DPS? What job is the most important for you? Do you feel like you should be expected to do more than just DPS, or do you think DPSing is your only job? Please leave a comment, leave a like, let me know what you think, and I will get back to you guys as soon as possible. I hope you guys have a great day, and I cannot stress how much I love the attention, and I love how much you guys have been watching the videos, and I love how the channel's grown. It's grown over 50%, over 100% in the last month or so. It's been really fun to just make these videos and talk about how I feel. So I really appreciate how everyone's been receiving that, and I hope to continue this in the future. So I really want you guys to know I appreciate it, and I can't wait to talk to you guys again. I'll see you guys another time. Have a good day.
Sidekick, 'cause I watch TV, I see how life is, and it's not easy, but still I'm right here, screaming I'm good, I'm good.
Wow. 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 And how'd that affect you with guys? Hey. Wow.